Hello data people. In this video I will showcase how to set up Leyline IO in a multi-machine environment. So I prepared a little sketch here which showcases how this whole demo is set up. I basically have 4 virtual machines, each one of them running Linux and each one taking on a specific task. So this is a blueprint for a larger installation, if you will, even though this is all running on my Mac with 4 virtual Linux machines. But in principle, this works the same whether it's on my Mac or whether it's an enterprise grade setup. It's always the same thing. This not only works for very large installations, but also for small installations. It really depends on your requirements, on whether you just run 1 node, 2 or 3 nodes, or 5, 6, 7, 8, 11 nodes. It's really up to you and your specific requirements. But in principle, this is how it's set up. If I ran it with more than 2 nodes, it would be exactly the same thing, just more nodes. So this should suffice to showcase how this works. So let's start off with the first node here, the first machine rather. This is a MySQL machine running on Linux, really just a basic installation of MySQL for the purpose of storing processing related information specific to Leyline IO. If you're doing a standard default installation on your Mac or Linux or Windows machine, this comes pre-installed with an H2 database. But if you're running a multi-node reactive cluster, so 2 or more nodes, you will require something other than H2. You actually require some sort of database that is multi-user capable instead of using something like H2 or SQLite, which is really just a single user database due to locking constraints and so forth. So again, for this showcase, I'm using MySQL. You could use other databases like Cassandra or Postgres or Mongo and more, but here we're using MySQL. The second node in the setup is the configuration server, or the second machine, I should say, is the configuration server. So that runs on its own virtual machine. The configuration server provides the web user interface, communicates with the reactive cluster, and also with the MySQL database. And then we have the reactive cluster itself, which is comprised of 2 nodes in my example, each one running a reactive engine, and together they form the reactive cluster. So let's dive into it. Let's take a look at the MySQL machine first. Bring that up here. So this is really a very basic MySQL installation. Let me go into MySQL itself, and the database we're using here is called Leyline. Could be any other name. Using Leyline here, and let's take a look at the tables. So we have 3 basic tables installed here, or created rather. The scripts for which you can find as part of the installation in the scripts directory. And what you do is you create your database and then run the script against it, and you'll end up with these 3 tables. So that's really all there is to the MySQL setup. What's important here is that obviously the MySQL database has to be reachable from the other machines. So let's get that out of the way. Let's head over to the configuration server. So the configuration server, again, is just a basic Leyline IO installation. There are some minor changes that we have to make if we want to run it in the kind of environment that I described here. So if you're going into this directory, .leyline config server /config, you will find a application.conf file. And I'll just explain real quick what I've changed here in the application.conf file to make it work on this kind of setup. So I'm bringing up VI so that we can take a look. So here in the leyline section, we have another section called config server and then rest server, which defines the network parameters. So I defined a canonical hostname here. It's llconfigserver.org.local. This is how I can reach this machine, or rather this configuration server, and that's the address. And then I have some bind parameters, port 5841, which is the default port, and hostname 0000. This is important, so I've just opened network access here so that I can access the configuration server from other machines as well. You may have different networking requirements, so set this up the way you need it to, but in principle, this works well for this showcase. Then one other change here is in the section called PECO Persistence JDBC. So in here, you will find a section called H2 file. And this section that's the default installation setup when you're using an H2 file database. But I've just added another section here called MySQL, and that defines the necessary parameters to access the MySQL database. So the important part here is the DB section, where I define the host, in this case called llmysql.org.local, the MySQL port, and the connection string for the MySQL connection. Just added a few other parameters here that I found useful, but basic connection strings should do. Username, root in my example, no password, and the driver, that is the driver for the MySQL connection here. So last not least, down here we have 3 entries: JDBC journal, JDBC read journal, JDBC snapshot store. This is in reference to the actual tables that we've created in the MySQL database. And what's important is that we also change the parameters here. By default, they're H2, but since we're using MySQL, I'm changing them to MySQL, which matches this entry up here. And that's it for the configuration server. So let's exit VI and fire up the configuration server like so. There we go. So that looks good. It says Leyline configuration server is up and running, so we're fine with that one. And having started that one, we're now going into looking at the setup of node 1. So again, bringing up the terminal for node 1. Here we are. And again, here, if you're heading to directory .leyline reactive engine config, you will again find an application.conf file, which I will VI into so that we can have a look. And here you find again the leyline section, leyline, and there's just a few parameters that I've set here. Again, canonical hostname llnode1.org.local, and networking bind parameters port 5842, and again hostname 0000, so I can reach it from the other machines. I've just opened up all network access here. Please note that this section here is called Reactive Engine, as opposed to in the application conf for the configuration server, it was called Config Server. Then further down, this is where we define the actual cluster setup. So we have some basic setup here for cluster management port. By default, it's 8558. I'll just leave it as that. And for the ability to find this node for the cluster, I'll again provide it with a canonical hostname, llnode1.org.local. Probably different in your environment. It's called llnode1.org.local in mine. A port 5843 and exactly the same settings for, no, not exactly the same, for bind hostname 0000, but the port is the same, 5843 again. So now for the cluster, for the actual cluster, that's this section, we define, first of all, the minimum number of members. in this case 2. So I have a 2 cluster setup, a 2-node cluster setup here. Could be any other number in your environment, depending on your requirements. Something obviously you can always change later. But what this really means is that this cluster setup expects 2 nodes to be running at a minimum. So you could have additional nodes running in your cluster, but the cluster will not form unless there are 2 nodes running that can also find each other. And here, in this section we call it seed nodes, we see the 2 nodes that make up the cluster in our showcase and with their respective addresses. So the protocol is PECO, then leyline at llnode1.org.local with the configured port 5843. And the same thing for the second node, except here it's called llnode2.org.local:5843. Last not least, we have, again, just like with the configuration server, within the PECO persistence JDBC section, we have an entry for MySQL. This is exactly the same entry as in the configuration server, no differences here. So I'm not going to go into that. And also at the bottom of the configuration, again, exactly the same as for the configuration server. I exchanged these settings from H2 here to MySQL so that they will work with the MySQL database. So that's it for node 1. And for node 2, I don't have to go into that because it's exactly the same setup as for node 1, except where I put down llnode1 in the application.conf file, you'll have to put in llnode2 or whatever other name you have for your host name there. So let's fire up the reactive engine on node 1. What happens now is it says I'm trying to connect to the cluster. So because we set it up so that a minimum of 2 nodes is required for the cluster, this node is waiting to discover or trying to discover another node. Once it discovers another node, both of them together will form the reactive cluster. So let's bring up the terminal for node number 2. And as I mentioned, it's exactly the same setup except for the host names in there. So I'm not going to bother going into the application conf file here. I'll just fire up the reactive engine on this one as well. And what we should be seeing is as soon as this starts up and it starts looking for another node, they should find each other and form the reactive cluster together. So let's bring this up. Okay, so now they found each other and they form the reactive cluster and they're ready to operate. So in order to look at this in a more simple way, let's bring up a browser window. And in this browser window, we will now invoke the Configuration Center, which is the web UI. The Configuration Center is loaded from the configuration server, and we know its name because we named it that way, llconfigserver.org.local, and the port is 5841, all default settings here. And that brings up the Configuration Center web UI. And in here, let me just log out of this real quick. This is the first thing you will see if you've never logged in. So what it will ask you to do is log into the configuration server. So the username is admin, password also admin by default. Obviously you can change that. Log in, and here it now says config server admin. So I'm logged into that. On initial installation, you will first have to head over to Settings, Cluster Storage, Clusters, and create a cluster setting here. I've already done that for this demo. So let me just show you what that looks like. If you hit plus here, it will come up with a dialog that allows you to enter the necessary information, which is the same as we see here on the right. I named this cluster setting Linux, and I added the 2 bootstrap nodes that we have configured. For your purposes, it might be sufficient to just add 1 bootstrap node. It's just important for the configuration center to know how to connect to the reactive engine. And if I bring up the sketch one more time here, this is what we're trying to accomplish. We're trying to get a connection to the reactive cluster from the web UI. Okay, so I already set this up. Once we've done the setting, we can head over to operations, and here up here I'm now able to pick the cluster that we've just created. Select that here. If you have multiple clusters that you work with, like your development cluster, your testing cluster, your production cluster, and maybe other clusters, you can set them up in settings and then select them here. For the cluster, we also have to log in. So let's enter again, default username admin, password admin. It will tell you whether it can reach a cluster under this address that we entered in the settings. So I'll hit login, and it will log in, and it will tell you so by having another login item up here showing you that you are logged into this cluster. But it's obvious because otherwise you wouldn't get this view here. On the left-hand side of this cluster tab here, we now can see our 2 nodes that we have configured and that we can see from the configuration center. And if you pick one of those, you're able to see some basic technical parameters. For example, which leyline version they're running, the address which they can be reached, which architecture they're running on, some other parameters regarding the Java virtual machine that the reactive engine of this node is running on, memory information, and other things. And going over to the first node in this setup, it's the same, slightly different parameters depending on that node, but other than that, it's really just for your reference to see whether everything's in good order. That concludes the explanation of how you can set up Leyline IO in a multi-machine environment. As you can tell, it's pretty simple and straightforward. There aren't very many mistakes you can make. Should you run into trouble trying to set this up, please just contact us at support@Leyline.io. We will be more than happy to help you with your setup and get you up and running in no time. Okay, that concludes this video. Thanks a lot for watching, and see you in the next video. Bye-bye.